What's going on, guys? Today I'm going to be playing some Vampire Survivors. It's a little roguelike game that came out a few years ago. It's super popular. I bet most of y'all know what I'm playing. And yeah, while I do that, I'm going to be reading to you some stories about the most evil teens that were sentenced to death. Really creepy, really disturbing. So yeah, you can just watch me play some Vampire Survivors, or if you prefer, you can leave this video in the background, do whatever, try and fall asleep. Just please do me a favor, make sure you're really comfortable, and let's get right into it. There are some cases where the facts are so shocking that people immediately pick a side. They hear what happened, they hear who did it, and they decide exactly how they feel. But every now and then a case comes along that leaves almost everyone confused. Not because the crime didn't happen, not because the evidence wasn't serious, but because the person at the center of it was so young that people couldn't agree on how to even think about the case. Was he a cold blooded killer? Was he a child who couldn't fully understand the consequences of his actions? Or was the truth somewhere in between? This is the story of Jordan Brown, a case that would eventually become one of the most controversial juvenile crime cases in modern American history. It began in the small community of Wampum, Pennsylvania, a quiet place where people didn't expect to wake up to national headlines. In February of 2009, life seemed normal inside the home shared by Chris Brown, his friend Kenzie Hook, and their children. Kenzie was 8 months pregnant and preparing for the arrival of a baby girl. Friends described her as excited about becoming a mother again. She already had 2 young daughters who lived with her and was looking forward to starting the next chapter of her life. To anyone looking from the outside, it appeared that the family was building toward a happy future. But on the morning of February 20th, everything changed. Inside the home, Kenzie was found dead. She had been shot while sleeping in her bed. The attack was sudden, brutal, and almost impossible to understand. What made it even more devastating was that Kenzie was 8 months pregnant. Her unborn child did not survive. News spread quickly throughout the community. Investigators rushed to the scene trying to determine who could have committed such a horrific crime. At first, many people assumed police would be searching for an adult suspect. Cases like this usually involve domestic disputes, jealous partners, or someone with a clear motive. Nobody expected investigators to focus on a child. Yet, very early in the investigation, attention shifted toward 11-year-old Jordan Brown, the son of Kenzie's fiancée. The accusation stunned people. 11 years old. Most kids at that age are worried about school, video games, sports, or what they're doing over the weekend. They are not the people the public imagines when they hear about homicide investigations. But according to authorities, Jordan had access to the weapon used in the shooting and had been inside the house when it happened. Almost immediately, the case exploded into national news. Reporters descended on the town. Television crews arrived, and legal experts began debating the case before it had even reached a courtroom. The reason was simple. If investigators were right, this would mean an 11-year-old boy had killed a pregnant woman and her unborn child. If investigators were wrong, an innocent child was about to face one of the most serious accusations imaginable. Either way, the stakes could not have been higher. As detectives worked to reconstruct the morning's events, prosecutors became increasingly convinced they had identified the correct suspect. They argued that Jordan had acted deliberately, and that the shooting was not an accident. Supporters of the prosecution pointed to the circumstances of the crime itself. Kenzie had been asleep. The shot was precise. According to investigators, this wasn't the kind of event that simply happened by mistake. But from the very beginning, the defense pushed back aggressively. They argued that the evidence was far weaker than prosecutors claimed and that authorities had rushed to judgment because the idea of a child committing such a shocking crime generated immediate attention. The debate quickly moved beyond the facts of the case and into a much larger conversation. What happens when someone accused of murder is barely enough to attend middle school? Should an 11-year-old ever face the same penalties as an adult? Can a child truly understand the consequences of a crime in the same way a grown person can? Across the country, people argued about these questions. Some believed the seriousness of the crime demanded the harshest possible punishment. Others believed that no child should ever be treated as an adult by the criminal justice system. As legal proceedings began, Jordan Brown found himself at the center of a debate much larger than himself. His name was suddenly appearing on national news broadcasts. Legal scholars discussed the case. Child psychologists weighed in, and politicians commented on it. Yet underneath all the headlines was a simple reality. A woman and her unborn child were dead. A family had been destroyed. And an 11-year-old boy was being accused of one of the most serious crimes imaginable. What nobody realized at the time was that the courtroom battle ahead would last for years, generate enormous controversy, and eventually force people to rethink not only this case, but the entire way America handles child accused of violent crimes. As the investigation continued, the story was about to become far more complicated than anyone initially expected. As the case moved forward, investigators and prosecutors remained convinced that Jordan Brown was responsible for Kenzie Hook's death. From their perspective, the timeline seemed straightforward. Jordan was in the house that morning. He had access to the shotgun. There were very few people present when the shooting occurred. To prosecutors, those facts pointed in one direction. But as defense attorneys started digging into the evidence, they found what they believed were serious problems with the state's theory. And those problems would eventually become the center of one of the longest and most controversial legal battles involving a child defendant in recent memory. One of the biggest issues involved in physical evidence itself. Contrary to what many people assumed after seeing the headlines about the case, there was no confession. There was no eyewitness who claimed to have seen Jordan pull the trigger. There was no video recording. There was no piece of evidence that clearly and directly showed exactly what happened inside that bedroom. Instead, prosecutors were building a case based largely on circumstantial evidence and their interpretation of the events that morning. Circumstantial evidence can absolutely lead to convictions. In fact, many criminal cases rely on it. But when the accused is only 11 years old, every piece of evidence receives even more scrutiny. As legal experts began reviewing the case, questions started emerging. Some wondered whether investigators had become so focused on Jordan early in the investigation that they stopped fully considering other possibilities. Others argued that the evidence was stronger than critics claimed and that people were simply uncomfortable accepting the idea that a child could commit such a crime. The debate grew louder as more details became public. News outlets across the country covered every development. Television commentators argued about the case almost nightly. Some people viewed Jordan as a dangerous child who had committed an unthinkable act. Others believed he was being turned into a suspect because investigators felt pressure to quickly solve a shocking crime. The legal process itself quickly became unusual. Because of Jordan's age, the case raised difficult questions that most murder prosecutions never face. Courts had to decide how a child accused of such a serious offense should be treated. Prosecutors pushed aggressively. Defense attorneys fought back just as hard. Every hearing seemed to generate new headlines. Every ruling sparked fresh debate. Meanwhile, as years continued passing. For Kenzie's family, the delays were frustrating. They wanted answers and accountability. For Jordan's supporters, the delays reflected on the complexity of a case that they believed was far clear-cut. As experts became involved, the discussion expanded beyond the crime itself. Psychologists weighed in on the child development. Legal scholars discussed juvenile justice. Researchers pointed to studies showing that children process consequences differently than adults. Even people who believed Jordan was guilty often disagreed about how someone his age should be punished. The case had become larger than a single criminal investigation. It was now part of a national conversation about children, responsibility, and the limits of the justice system. Then came one of the most important turning points. As defense attorneys challenged the prosecution's evidence, they argued that many conclusions investigators presented as facts were actually assumptions. They questioned forensic interpretations. They challenged witness accounts. They highlighted inconsistencies. Little by little, what initially seemed like a straightforward case began looking far more complicated. The public noticed this shift as well. People who had confidently formed opinions after reading every headline suddenly found themselves reconsidering. Cases are often very different when examined inside a courtroom than when summarized in a news report. What made the situation even more unusual was the amount of time passing without a final resolution. Year after year, the case continued generating legal battles. Appeals were filed. Rulings were changed. New arguments emerged, and Jordan was growing older while the legal system continued trying to determine what had happened when he was only 11. By this point, the story had already lasted far longer than most people expected. What began as a shocking homicide investigation was turning into a legal marathon. Meanwhile, investigators and prosecutors remained committed to their position. They believed the evidence supported their conclusions. They argued that the seriousness of the crime should not be ignored simply because of Jordan's age. The defense remained equally committed to proving that authorities had made a mistake. As both sides prepared for the next stage of the fight, the case became increasingly polarized. Depending on who you asked, Jordan Brown was either a child killer who deserved justice or an innocent boy caught in a flawed investigation. And as the courtroom battle entered its most critical phase, a series of decisions would soon reshape the entire case. Decisions that would shock many people who had followed the story from the beginning and ultimately force courts to answer the questions that had been hanging over the case for years. Was there actually enough evidence to prove that Jordan Brown committed the crime beyond a reasonable doubt? As the years passed, the Jordan Brown case slowly transformed from a local homicide investigation into one of the most debated juvenile justice cases in America. What happened, it is so unusual, wasn't just the age of the accused. It was the fact that the deeper people looked into the evidence, the less certain the outcome seemed. In many murder cases, public opinion gradually moves in one direction as more facts become available. Here, the opposite happened. Every new court hearing seemed to divide people even further. Some remained convinced Jordan was responsible. Others became increasingly skeptical that prosecutors could actually prove it. And at the time, the center of everything was a question that would determine the rest of Jordan's life. Did the evidence truly show what happened inside that house on the morning Kenzie Hook was killed? As the legal battle intensified, defense attorneys continued attacking the prosecution's case from every possible angle. They argued that investigators had built their theory around assumptions rather than direct proof. They pointed out that while prosecutors believe Jordan committed the shooting, belief and proof are not the same thing. In criminal court, especially in a murder case, prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard exists because the consequences of getting it wrong are enormous. And when the person on trial is a child, the stakes feel even higher. One major issue involved the timeline itself. Defense attorneys carefully examined exactly what happened that morning, minute by minute. They questioned whether prosecutors could truly establish every step they claimed occurred. They scrutinized witness statements and looked for inconsistencies. They challenged the idea that the sequence of events presented by the state was the only possible explanation. To the defense, the prosecution's theory depended on filling gaps with assumptions. They argued that investigators had become so focused on Jordan early that they stopped looking elsewhere. The public followed these developments closely. News organizations covered nearly every major ruling. Legal analysts debated the evidence. Child psychologists discussed whether someone Jordan's age could fully understand the consequences of such actions. Some people focused primarily on the crime itself. Others focused on Jordan's age. This created an unusual situation where even people who agreed on the facts sometimes disagreed completely on what should happen next. Meanwhile, Jordan himself was getting older. This detail often gets overlooked when people discuss the case today. The legal process was moving so slowly that the boy at the center of the controversy was no longer the same age as when the crime occurred. Years passed while courts argued over evidence, procedures, and legal standards. Jordan's life remained frozen in uncertainty, while adults debated his future. Regardless of where someone stood on the case, almost everyone agreed on one thing. The situation was extraordinary. As hearings continued, judges were forced to examine the evidence in incredible detail. Every witness statement mattered. Every forensic finding mattered. Every challenge raised by the defense had to be addressed. The courts weren't deciding whether people believed Jordan was guilty. They were deciding whether prosecutors had proven it according to the law. That distinction became increasingly important as the case progressed. Then came a series of rulings that dramatically changed the direction of the case. Some courts began questioning aspects of the prosecution's evidence. Certain findings that once appeared solid were re-examined. Arguments that had initially received little attention suddenly became central. The defense gained momentum. Supporters of Jordan viewed these developments as confirmation that investigators had rushed to judgment. Prosecutors, however, maintained that the evidence still supported their conclusion. The back and forth continued year after year. For Kenzie's family, each delay meant more waiting, more hearings, more uncertainty. They had already endured an unimaginable loss. Now they were being forced to relive it and repeatedly as the case moved through the legal system. Families of victims often describe this as one of the hardest parts of major criminal cases. The event itself is devastating, but the years that follow can be exhausting in a completely different way. At the same time, Jordan's supporters argued that the innocent child was facing the possibility of spending much of his life paying for a crime he did not commit. They pointed to weaknesses they saw in the evidence and emphasized the importance of getting the outcome right rather than getting it quickly. As a result, the case became about much more than a single homicide investigation. It became a debate about fairness, proof, and the responsibilities of the justice system when dealing with children. Eventually, after years of legal battles, appeals, and reviews, the case reached its most important stage. Courts were no longer focused solely on the original accusations. They were now evaluating whether the prosecution had actually met the burden required to sustain those accusations. This wasn't just another hearing. This was the point where years of arguments, evidence, and controversy would finally be tested. People on both sides watched closely. Some expected the original conclusion to stand. Others believed the entire case was about to change. And when the final decisions began arriving, they would shock many people who had followed the story from the very beginning, transforming Jordan Brown from one of the most controversial juvenile defendants in American history into the central of a legal outcome that few observers had predicted when the investigation first started. The final chapter would not only determine Jordan's future, but would also leave lasting questions about how the justice system handles cases involving children accused of the most serious crimes imaginable. But the next story is different. In this case, there was never much doubt about who committed the crime. The shock came from the motive, the planning, and the age of the person at the center of it all. When people first heard about the case, many assumed there had to be some major misunderstanding. Surely a teenager could not be responsible for something so calculated. Surely there had to be more to the story. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a chain of events that would leave an entire community stunned. This is the story of Alyssa Bustamante, a case that remains one of the most disturbing examples of how dark a young mind can become. Before the crime, Alyssa appeared to many people like a typical teenager living in Missouri. She went to school, spent time online, and interacted with friends like countless other teenagers her age. But beneath the surface, there were warning signs. According to people who later examined her background, Alyssa had struggled with serious emotional and mental health issues for years. There had been previous concerns about self-harm and troubling behavior. Family members and professionals were aware that she faced challenges, but nobody could have imagined how far things would eventually go. In October 2009, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton left her home to go visit friends in her neighborhood. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. Her family had no reason to think anything was wrong. But when Elizabeth failed to return home, concern quickly turned into panic. Family members began searching. Neighbors joined in. Soon law enforcement became involved. Missing child cases generate immediate urgency because investigators know the first hours are often the most important. Everyone hoped Elizabeth would be found safe. Unfortunately, as the search expanded, investigators began discovering clues that suggested something far more serious had happened. Volunteers searched fields, wooded areas, and nearby properties. The community came together in an effort to locate the missing girl. As news spread, more people joined the search. Parents watched the story unfold and imagined their own children in the same situation. The entire area became focused on one goal: finding Elizabeth. Then investigators made a discovery that changed everything. Evidence led them toward a wooded area near the neighborhood. What they found there transformed a missing child investigation into a homicide case. Elizabeth had been murdered. The news devastated the community. Parents were horrified. Neighbors struggled to process what had happened. A young girl who had simply gone outside was now gone forever. Investigators immediately began working to determine who was responsible. In many child homicide cases, detectives spend months identifying suspects. Here, however, the investigation moved unusually fast. As authorities interviewed people connected to the area, attention began focusing on someone nobody expected. Alyssa was only 15 years old. At first glance, she seemed like an unlikely suspect. Yet detectives quickly uncovered information that made them look much closer. According to investigators, Alyssa had been one of the last people known to have interacted with Elizabeth. As they continued gathering evidence, the case against her grew stronger. Then came one of the most shocking developments of all. Authorities discovered writings and online activity that appeared deeply troubling. Investigators alleged that Alyssa had expressed violent thoughts before the murder. According to prosecutors, this wasn't a crime driven by anger, revenge, or a personal dispute. Instead, they argued that Alyssa committed the murder because she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. The alleged motive stunned everyone. Most murderers, no matter how terrible, have some understandable explanation behind them: jealousy, money, revenge, fear. This case seemed different. Investigators believed the act itself was the motive. If true, it would make the crime even harder to comprehend. As detectives continued piecing together what happened, they uncovered details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of planning and preparation. The community that had come together to search for Elizabeth now found itself facing a horrifying reality. The person accused of taking her life wasn't a dangerous stranger passing through town. According to investigators, it was another young person from the same community. And as the case moved toward court, even more shocking details would emerge about what allegedly happened before, during, and after the murders. Details that would leave many people wondering whether anyone truly understood what was going on inside Alyssa's mind. As investigators continued building their case against Alyssa, the story became even more disturbing. At first, many people assumed there had to be something missing from the investigation. They wanted an explanation that made sense. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe there was some kind of conflict between Alyssa and Elizabeth that hadn't been revealed yet. Maybe there was a motive hidden somewhere in the evidence. But the deeper authorities dug, the more unsettling the alleged motive appeared to be. According to investigators, there was no long-running feud, no revenge, no personal grudge. Instead, prosecutors would later argue that Alyssa committed the murder largely because she was curious about what it would feel like. That explanation shocked people across the country, because it almost felt impossible to understand. Most violent crimes, no matter how terrible, have a motive that people can at least recognize. This case seemed different. It almost felt random, and that randomness made it even more frightening. As detectives searched Alyssa's background, they began uncovering information that painted a troubling picture. Family struggles, mental health concerns, previous incidents of self-harm, and other warning signs started becoming public. People knew who Alyssa described, someone often appeared normal on the surface, but who also seemed to carry significant emotional problems beneath that surface. Looking back afterward, many people wondered whether the warning signs had been more serious than anyone realized at the time. This is something that happens in many high-profile cases. After a tragedy occurs, people revisit old memories and suddenly notice details that once seemed unimportant. Actions that appeared unusual but harmless suddenly take on new meaning. Conversations that were forgotten became significant. Yet hindsight is powerful. Things often look obvious after the fact that were much harder to recognize beforehand. Meanwhile, investigators focused on reconstructing exactly what happened on the day Elizabeth disappeared. According to prosecutors, Alyssa had lured the 9-year-old into a wooded area nearby the neighborhood. What allegedly happened next horrified even experienced detectives. Authorities believed Alyssa attacked Elizabeth before ultimately killing her. Prosecutors argued that after the murder, Alyssa attempted to conceal what she had done by burying the victim in a shallow grave. The level of alleged planning became a major focus of the case. Investigators pointed to evidence suggesting this was not a completely spontaneous act. They argued there were indicators that Alyssa had thought about the violence beforehand. Then came one of the most widely discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. Investigators recovered journal entries that attracted national attention. According to prosecutors, some of the writings appeared to discuss violent thoughts and emotional reactions surrounding the crime. News organizations reported extensively on these entries, and many people viewed them as some of the strongest evidence against Alyssa. The writings became central to public discussions because they seemed to offer a glimpse into her mindset. Whether people viewed them as proof of guilt, evidence of severe mental health struggles, or both, they became impossible to ignore. The case was no longer simply about what happened to Elizabeth. It was also about understanding the person accused of committing the crime. As legal proceedings moved forward, public interest continued growing. The story combines several elements that always attract attention: a young victim, a young suspect, shocking allegations, and a question about psychology and mental health. Experts began appearing on television discussing adolescent brain development. Psychologists debated whether someone Alyssa's age could fully understand the consequences of such actions. Others focused on the warning signs that might have existed before the crime. Some argued that the case demonstrated the importance of recognizing severe mental health issues earlier. Others cautioned against oversimplifying the situation or assuming that every troubled teenager poses a danger to others. The discussion became complex because there were no easy answers. For Elizabeth's family, however, those broader debates could never change the reality of what had happened. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and a loved one whose life had barely begun. While the public focused on court proceedings and psychological analysis, the family was forced to live with a loss that would never fully heal. That's something that often gets lost in high profile criminal cases. People become fascinated by the suspect, the investigation, and the courtroom drama. Meanwhile, the victim's family continues facing the consequences every single day. For them, the case was never about headlines. It was about a little girl who should have had decades of life ahead of her. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they believed they had assembled a powerful case. They pointed to physical evidence, witness accounts, Alyssa's own statements, and the writings recovered during the investigation. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, focused heavily on Alyssa's age and mental health history. They argued that understanding her psychological condition was essential to understanding the case itself. The defense was not simply fighting over guilt or innocence. They were also fighting over how responsibility should be viewed when the accused is a teenager with significant emotional and psychological issues. By now, the case had become one of the most talked about juvenile murder cases in America. Every major development generated headlines. Every courtroom hearing attracted attention. Yet the most dramatic phase was still ahead. Because as the legal battle approached its conclusion, the court would hear details about Alyssa's mental state, her actions after the crime, and the evidence prosecutors believed proved exactly what had happened in those woods. The outcome would ultimately determine not only Alyssa's future, but also how one of the most disturbing juvenile homicide cases in recent memory would be remembered for years to come. And when the final chapter arrived, the details revealed inside the courtroom would leave many observers even more shocked than the original headlines. As the case moved closer to its conclusion, the prosecutors began presenting what they believed was the clearest picture yet of what had happened that day to Elizabeth. By this point, the basic facts of the case were already known throughout the country. A 9-year-old girl had left her home expecting an ordinary afternoon. She never came back. A 15-year-old girl from the same community had been arrested. The evidence against her appeared overwhelming. Yet the closer the legal proceedings came to finish the line, the more people became fascinated by questions that seemed impossible to answer. Why? Not just what happened, not just who did it, but why someone so young would allegedly commit such a terrible crime. During the court proceedings, prosecutors laid out the timeline they believed had unfolded. They argued that Alyssa intentionally led Elizabeth into a wooded area near the neighborhood before carrying out the attack. According to prosecution, this wasn't an accident, a misunderstanding, or a momentary loss of control. They argued it was a deliberate act. What made the allegations so difficult for many people to process was the apparent lack of a traditional motive. There was no argument over money, no revenge, no jealousy, no long-running conflict. The prosecution's theory suggested something much darker than the act itself was the goal. As more details became public, the case attracted enormous attention. News reports focused heavily on Alyssa's writings, behavior, and statements. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts weighed in from all sides. Some believed the case showed the dangers of untreated mental health struggles. Others warned against oversimplifying the issue. Millions of teenagers struggle with emotional problems, depression, or difficulty family situations without even becoming violent. Then, the reality experts argued was much more complicated. Human behavior rarely comes down to one simple explanation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's family continued enduring the most difficult part of any criminal case, reliving the tragedy over and over again. Every hearing brought the events back into the public view. Every news story reminded them of what they had lost. While the public debated legal arguments and psychological theories, Elizabeth's loved ones were left dealing with a reality that no verdict could ever change. Their daughter was gone. No sentence, no courtroom victory, and no explanation would bring her back. As the prosecution continued presenting evidence, defense attorneys focused heavily on Alyssa's mental state. They argued that her age and psychological condition could not be ignored. At 15 years old, she was still a teenager. Her brain was still developing. Her history included serious emotional struggles that, according to the defense, should be considered when determining responsibility and punishment. This became one of the most debated aspects of the case. Few people questioned the seriousness of the crime itself. The debate centered on how the justice system should respond when the person responsible is still a child in many respects. The courtroom became a place where two different stories were being presented at the same time. The prosecution focused on actions. They emphasized planning, evidence, and responsibility. The defense focused on psychology, age, and mental health. Jurors and observers were left trying to understand both perspectives while never losing sight of the victim at the center of the case. Eventually, Alyssa chose to plead guilty. The decision removed the uncertainty of a trial and meant that the focus would shift towards sentencing. For many observers, the guilty plea was one of the most significant moments in the entire case. After years of headlines, speculation, and debate, there was no longer a question about whether she would be held responsible. Instead, the question became how the court should punish someone who committed such a serious crime while still being a teenager. The sentencing hearing drew widespread attention. Family members spoke. Attorneys presented arguments. The courtroom examined Alyssa's background, her mental health history, and the devastating impact of the crime. Throughout the proceedings, emotions ran high. Cases involving child victims often generate especially strong reactions because people see so much lost potential. Elizabeth had barely begun her life. The future she should have had was gone forever. When the sentence was finally handed down, it brought the legal chapter of the case to a close. Yet for many people, the emotional questions never really disappeared. Even today, the case continues to generate discussion because it sits at the intersection of several difficult topics: juvenile crime, mental health, personal responsibility, and violence committed at a young age. People continue debating what warning signs existed, whether the tragedy could have been prevented, and what lessons should be learned from it. More than anything, the case remains memorable because of how shocking it felt from beginning to end. A young victim, a young offender, a motive that many people struggle to understand, and a community left searching for answers long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The story of Alyssa became one of the most infamous juvenile murder cases in modern America, not because it offered simple explanations, but because it raised questions that still don't have easy answers. And while this case was disturbing because of the apparent randomness of the crime, the next story will be unsettling for a completely different reason. The next case begins with a teenager who didn't just want freedom from rules or conflict. According to investigators, he wanted something far more extreme. What followed would leave an entire family destroyed, and would become one of the most shocking examples of how quickly ordinary teenage frustration can turn into something unimaginable. But the next story is disturbing for a different reason. This time, the motive wasn't curiosity. It wasn't random violence. According to prosecutors, it was about removing obstacles. It was about a teenager becoming so consumed by his own desires that he began viewing people closest to him as problems to be solved. When the truth finally came out, people across the country struggled to understand how someone so young could make decisions with consequences so devastating. This is the story of Chandler Halderson, a case that started with lies, grew into a web of deception, and eventually exploded into one of the most shocking family murder investigations in recent years. Before the murders, Chandler appeared to be living a fairly normal life. He was a young man living with his parents, Bart and Krista Halderson, in Wisconsin. To friends and relatives, the family seemed stable. Bart was known as hardworking and supportive. Krista was deeply involved in her family. From the outside, there was little reason to believe anything was seriously wrong. But behind closed doors, Chandler was hiding something. Actually, he was hiding a lot. According to investigators, Chandler had spent months, possibly years, building an entirely fake version of his life. He allegedly lied about attending college. He lied about grades. He lied about future career opportunities, and he lied about job prospects. He even allegedly lied about an attractive employment opportunity that would supposedly launch him into a successful future. Family members believed these stories because they trusted him. Parents naturally want to believe their children are working towards success. Bart and Krista reportedly supported Chandler and encouraged him. The problem was that much of what Chandler claimed was happening wasn't real. As time passed, maintaining those lies became increasingly difficult. Every lie requires another lie to support it. One false story creates a problem that leads to another false story. Eventually, the entire structure becomes fragile. According to prosecutors, Chandler was approaching the point where the truth was about to come out. His parents were starting to ask questions. They wanted documentation. They wanted answers, and they wanted proof regarding some of the claims he had been making. For most people, being caught in a lie is embarrassing. It leads to difficult conversations, disappointment, and consequences. Prosecutors would later argue that Chandler chose a much darker solution. In July 2021, Bart and Krista suddenly disappeared. At first, Chandler offered an explanation. According to him, his parents had left unexpectedly for a trip. He described them traveling to a cabin. He spoke as though nothing unusual had happened. But almost immediately, people began noticing problems with the story. Friends and relatives couldn't reach Bart or Krista. Messages went unanswered. Their behavior seemed completely out of character. The people who knew them best felt something wasn't right. Missing person investigations often begin with small inconsistencies. That's exactly what happened here. As concern grew, authorities started looking more closely at Chandler's version of events. The detectives interviewed him. They examined timelines. They compared the statements against available evidence. Very quickly, cracks started appearing. Certain details didn't line up. Some explanations seemed difficult to verify. Others directly conflicted with the evidence investigators were gathering. The more detectives looked, the more suspicious they became. Then the investigation took a dramatic turn. Evidence began emerging that suggested Bart and Krista had not voluntarily left on a trip at all. Investigators started uncovering information that pointed towards something much worse. Search efforts intensified. Detectives began focusing heavily on Chandler himself. What initially appeared to be a missing person case was rapidly transforming into a homicide investigation. As authorities dug deeper, they uncovered a series of lies that seemed to stretch far beyond the disappearance itself. The image Chandler had presented to friends and family started falling apart piece by piece. Detectives discovered that many of the accomplishments and opportunities he claimed to have achieved were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Suddenly, investigators had a possible motive. If Chandler's parents were about to discover the truth about his life, what would happen next? According to prosecutors, Chandler knew exactly what would happen. His carefully constructed image would collapse. The people who trusted him most would learn that much of what he had been telling them was false. Prosecutors would later argue that rather than face that reality, Chandler chose an unthinkable alternative. As evidence continued accumulating, investigators became convinced they were uncovering one of the most calculated family murder cases the region had seen in years. And as search teams continued looking for answers, they were about to discover evidence that would completely destroy Chandler's story and reveal just how far prosecutors believed he was willing to go to protect a lie. As investigators dug deeper into Bart and Krista Halderson's disappearance, Chandler's story began falling apart at an astonishing speed. In the early days of the investigation, he still tried to maintain the image that his parents had simply left on a trip. He spoke to detectives. He spoke to family and friends. He acted concerned. He even participated in some discussions about locating his parents, but investigators quickly noticed something that often appears in cases built on deception. The more Chandler talked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Small details changed, timelines shifted, certain claims could not be verified. What initially seemed like minor discrepancies soon became major problems. Detectives started examining digital evidence, phone records, surveillance footage, and Chandler's online activity. Piece by piece, they began reconstructing what had actually happened during the days surrounding Bart and Krista's disappearance. As they did, the picture that emerged looked nothing like the story Chandler had been telling. According to prosecutors, his parents had never left for a vacation. There was no spontaneous trip, no cabin getaway, no unexpected travel plans, and instead investigators believed something much darker had happened inside the family home. One of the biggest turning points came when authorities began uncovering evidence connected to locations Chandler had visited after his parents disappeared. Search teams recovered human remains in rural areas connected to the investigation. The discoveries shocked the community. At that moment, the case officially shifted from a missing person investigation into a murder investigation. For friends and relatives who had been desperately hoping Bart and Krista would be found alive, the news was devastating. The worst fears were becoming reality. As forensic experts analyzed the evidence, prosecutors became increasingly confident in the theory. They alleged that Chandler had murdered both of his parents and then taken an expensive step to hide what he had done. According to investigators, this wasn't a crime committed in a moment of uncontrolled anger. They argued it involved planning, cleanup efforts, transportation of evidence, and repeated attempts to mislead authorities afterward. Every new discovery seemed to strengthen that theory. What made the case especially disturbing was the alleged motive. Unlike crimes involving money, revenge, or long-standing family conflict, prosecutors argued that the murders were largely connected to Chandler's lies. For months, possibly years, he had created a fictional version of his life. He allegedly told people he was succeeding in school when he wasn't. He claimed to have opportunities that didn't exist. He described a future that was largely imaginary. Maintaining those lies became harder and harder. Eventually, investigators believed Chandler had reached a point where he could no longer keep the deception alive. The more detectives learned about his false claims, the more important they became to understanding the case. Friends later discovered that many things they had accepted as true simply weren't. Family members who had trusted him learned that major parts of his story had been fabricated. Prosecutors argued that Bart and Krista were beginning to uncover the truth themselves. They were asking questions. They wanted proof. They expected answers. According to the state's theory, Chandler knew he was running out of time. As the investigation expanded, authorities uncovered additional evidence that painted an increasingly damaging picture. Surveillance footage, digital records, forensic findings, and witness statements all became important pieces of the case. Unlike many murder investigations that rely heavily on confessions, prosecutors were building a detailed timeline through physical and digital evidence. They argued that every major step Chandler took after the murders pointed toward consciousness of guilt. According to investigators, he wasn't acting like someone searching for missing parents. He was acting like someone trying to maintain a story that was collapsing around him. The community followed every development closely. Cases involving the murder of parents by their own children always attract attention because they violate one of the strongest expectations people have about family and relationships. Most people view family as a source of support and protection. When those bonds are broken in such an extreme way, it shocks people on a deep level. The Halderson case became one of those stories that people couldn't stop talking about because the alleged motive seemed so disproportionate to the crime itself. Most people have been caught in lies before. Most people have disappointed their parents at some point. But prosecutors argued that Chandler responded to that pressure in a way almost nobody could imagine. By the time authorities formally charged him, the case had become one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Wisconsin. Yet, despite all the evidence already uncovered, the most dramatic moments were still ahead. Because once the trial began, jurors would hear the full scope of Chandler's alleged deception. They would see how many lies had been told, how long they had been maintained, and how prosecutors believed these lies eventually led to murder. The courtroom would become the place where every piece of the puzzle was assembled. And as the trial approached, investigators believed they had gathered enough evidence not only to prove what happened to Bart and Krista Halderson, but also to reveal how an ordinary young man had allegedly gone from telling harmless lies to committing one of the most shocking family crimes in recent history. The details presented in court would leave many observers stunned, because the deeper people looked into Chandler's double life, the harder it became to understand where the lies ended and the tragedy truly began. As Chandler's trial finally began, prosecutors were ready to present what they believed was the complete story behind one of the most shocking family murder cases Wisconsin had seen in years. By this point, the public already knew the basic outline of the investigation. Bart and Krista Halderson had disappeared. Chandler had provided explanations that investigators claimed were false. Human remains had been discovered. The case had transformed from a missing person investigation into a double homicide prosecution. But the trial would reveal just how extensive the alleged deception had become and how many lies Chandler had allegedly told before everything unraveled. Over the course of the proceedings, jurors were shown a mountain of evidence. Prosecutors carefully walked them through Chandler's life leading up to the murders. They argued that he had spent years creating a version of himself that simply didn't exist. According to the state, he wasn't attending school the way he claimed. The academic achievements he described were largely fictional. The career opportunities he talked about weren't real. The prestigious job offer he supposedly received never existed. One by one, prosecutors dismantled the image of Chandler that never even existed. And what made the evidence so powerful wasn't any single lie. It was the sheer number of them. Jurors heard how deception had become a normal part of Chandler's daily life. According to prosecutors, he wasn't maintaining one false story. He was maintaining dozens. As the trial continued, investigators described how Bart Halderson had reportedly started asking more questions before his disappearance. Unlike friends or acquaintances who might simply accept Chandler's explanations, Bart was his father. He expected proof. He expected honesty, and he wanted answers regarding school, employment, and future plans. Prosecutors argued that Chandler realized he was approaching a point where his entire fictional life was about to collapse. Years of lies were on the verge of being exposed. The image he had carefully built was starting to crack. According to the prosecution, that's when everything changed. Jurors then heard evidence regarding the investigation itself. Detectives testified about the inconsistencies in Chandler's statements. They described how his version of events repeatedly changed as new evidence emerged. Surveillance footage, phone records, and digital activity, and the forensic findings were presented piece by piece. What made the case particularly damaging for the defense was how many independent sources seemed to support the prosecution's timeline. Rather than relying on a single witness or confession, investigators had assembled a complex puzzle made up of dozens of separate pieces. Each piece alone might not have been enough. Together, prosecutors argued they formed a clear picture of guilt. One of the most dramatic aspects of the trial involved the evidence surrounding Chandler's actions after his parents disappeared. Prosecutors argued that innocent people generally spend their time searching for missing loved ones, cooperating with authorities, and trying to generate leads. According to the state, Chandler instead spent much of his time maintaining false stories and attempting to explain away suspicious circumstances. Investigators testified about efforts they believed were designed to conceal what had happened. Every new detail made the prosecution's theory appear stronger. Throughout the proceedings, the defense faced an enormous challenge. They attempted to raise doubts about parts of the investigation and question certain conclusions drawn by prosecutors. But the volume of evidence presented by the state proved difficult to overcome. Jurors weren't just hearing about the murders themselves. They were hearing about months and years of deception leading up to them. Prosecutors wanted jurors to understand that the murders didn't occur in isolation. In their view, they were the final result of a long pattern of dishonesty that eventually spiraled out of control. For many observers, one of the most chilling aspects of the trial was how ordinary the situation initially seemed. Countless young adults exaggerate accomplishments. Many people lie to parents about grades, school, relationships, or career plans. Those lies usually end with arguments, disappointment, or damaged trust. Prosecutors argued that Chandler's case followed a completely different path. According to their theory, he became so invested in maintaining a false reality that he viewed exposure as something he could not allow to happen. If true, it represented an extraordinary escalation from everyday dishonesty to unimaginable violence. As the trial ended its final phase, prosecutors summarized their arguments for jurors. They argued that Bart and Krista Halderson had spent years supporting their son, encouraging him, and believing in the future he described. In return, prosecutors claimed Chandler repaid that trust with deception and ultimately murder. It was a devastating narrative, and one that left many people in the courtroom visibly emotional. The victims weren't strangers, they weren't rivals, they were his parents. Eventually, after hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing extensive evidence, the jury reached its verdict. Chandler was found guilty. The decision brought the legal battle to an end, but it did little to answer the questions how people continued asking afterward. How does someone reach that point? How does a young man from what appeared to be a stable family environment end up at the center of a case like this? It's a question that continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and ordinary people alike, because the answer isn't simple. Cases like this rarely have a single cause. They emerge from a combination of choices, circumstances, personality traits, and escalating decisions that eventually lead somewhere catastrophic. In the years since the trial, the Halderson case has remained one of the most discussed family trials in history. True crime audiences continue studying it because it feels almost unbelievable. At its core, the story begins with something common: a young person lying about school and future plans. But those lies grew larger, then larger still. Eventually, they became so significant that, according to prosecutors, Chandler believed his entire life would collapse if the truth came out. Rather than admit failure, rather than face embarrassment, rather than disappoint the people around him, prosecutors argued he chose a path that destroyed everything. For his parents, friends, and loved ones, the case left scars that will never fully disappear. They lost two people who were deeply loved by those around them. Their deaths shocked a community and devastated everyone who knew them. No verdict could change that. No sentence could undo it. The courtroom could provide accountability, but it could never restore what was lost. More than anything, the case serves as a reminder of how dangerous deception can become when it grows unchecked. Most lies eventually fall apart. Most people are forced to confront realities at some point. The overwhelming majority do so without violence. But according to prosecutors, Chandler spent so long constructing a fictional version of himself that he became trapped inside it. And when the walls finally started closing in, the consequences were catastrophic. Yet, as disturbing as the Halderson case was, the next story takes us in a completely different direction.